most of you, perfect, thank you, whoever did that with the recording. So yeah, as most of you probably know, there are these standards that are being developed. And so what these are is national standards that will apply to all long-term care homes across the country. There are two organizations that are going through this in tandem, one of them being HSO and the other one being the CSA group. And each of their streams of standards are focused on two different areas. So the CSA group standards are focused on infection prevention and control and operations. And the HSO standards are focused on resident and family-centered care. So these two processes are going on in tandem with two separate technical committees, separate processes of consultation, but ultimately aimed at developing standards that will be applied nationally. So today, I'm just going to focus on the HSO standards, but some of the members from this committee participated in the CSA group's consultation session back in August. We talked about that at the last meeting, where the focus was really on infection control and the environment of care homes. And some really great suggestions were shared at the consultation session. So HSO's process, they started back in the spring of 2021. They had over 250 people apply to be part of their technical committee. 32 people were selected. The names of who's on that committee is publicly available if you're interested. And basically HSO has been engaging in this national consultation process. And the piece of note to this group is that they are actively seeking as many diverse voices as possible to help inform the standards, which I think is a good thing. They are talking about equity and inclusion a fair bit, and they're interested to hear from folks, which is, I think, really important. Okay, the next slide here shows you their timeline. Now, what I've learned about these standards is normally when they do these standards, they take 3 years to do it. Because of the climate of long-term care right now, because of the impacts of COVID, because of everything that's come to light, they have rapidly accelerated this because there is significant demand and need for major systemic reform and change. So you'll see on the timeline here, they're compressing what's normally 3 years into 21 months. And this gives you a sense of kind of the steps that they're going through. So right now they're in the stage of drafting the standards. So this is a key moment in time where they're looking for consultations and feedback about really specific nitty-gritty type of things. They heard a lot generally from the surveys, and I'll speak a bit to the survey results that they got just briefly, just to highlight. But they're looking for more specific details now. And like I mentioned, they're looking for consultation with diverse groups. There was a town hall that happened about 2 weeks ago that I was invited to that was specifically EDI focus group, where they were speaking to people about culture and diversity and what can be done. Which was great. And there are going to be more similar sessions happening over the next couple of months. In January, they're going to launch the drafted standards and do public consultation where anybody and everybody can provide feedback. And then the plan for the final standards is that sometime next fall in 2022. Did somebody have a question or was that a sneeze? No, I can't hear, I can't see everybody's face with this view. I can only see a few of you. Anyway, if you have a question, please feel free to interrupt me or put your hand up or drop it in the chat. So all this to say is that this is basically an accelerated process. Rick, you have a question or comment?
So just clarify for me, because I don't know HSO. Is HSO going to replace like Ontario standards and unify them in with Quebec as well as British Columbia? Because BC standards are not the same as Ontario, which is not the same as Quebec. And so I'm just wondering, where does HSO stand in that? And how does it relate to accreditation standards as well? Thanks.
Great question, Rick. Great question. So yeah, to clarify for everybody. So every province, their healthcare is managed separately and legislated separately. So each province has their own act that relates to what's legislated, required, what's inspected against. So the Ontario Long-Term Care Home Act will remain Ontario's, and that will remain the legislation that the homes have to achieve. So one of the things that's fascinating to me is that the Long-Term Care Home Act is actually under review right now. It's being rewritten completely. The provincial government is supposed to be releasing a new act sometime in the next few months. And so that process is happening very fast too. And it's happening at the same time as the standards development.
Yeah.
Are these organizations talking to each other a lot? Who knows? Dan, you've got a question.
Yeah,
comment.
well, or a comment. Like my understanding is that the HSO and Standards Council work is pushed by the federal government. They're trying to establish national standards, and they're saying that they will give the provinces money to achieve the standards that will be established nationally. And several provinces have said, just give us money. And so it's without telling us what standards, but it's going to look like, if you're familiar with the building code, there's a national building code and each province then has its own provincial building code. And what a real operator needs to respect is the provincial code.
Exactly. Thank you, Dan. So it's going to be interesting to see if there are contradictions between these things or pieces that are unclear for folks, because I think that will be very challenging to operationalize. But ultimately, like Dan is saying, those provincial legislated mandates are what the homes are ultimately having to have in place, and what they're inspected against, and what there are public reports that show what they're delinquent on and whatnot. And in terms of your other question, Rick, in terms of what does HSO, what is that connection to Accreditation Canada? They're affiliated. And so if you remember the old long-term care services standard, this new national standard will replace that body of standards. So homes that are going through the Accreditation Canada process, this will be those standards. So this isn't like in addition to, yeah, so hopefully that clears it up. There's another accreditation body called CARF, which also has its own long-term care standards. And some homes choose to use CARF, some homes choose to use Accreditation Canada. I'm not clear where CARF standards are in alignment with the rest of this. That part's a mystery to me, but it seems like the HSO and the CSA group standards will be like Dan is describing, right? Like this code for the minimum baseline. If you're providing long-term care in this country, this is what you have to be doing. But again, will be really interesting how this actually plays out province to province in the country. We've heard, you know, within our team from government folks that there is a desire in Ontario to be a leader in long-term care. That is what they are striving for. So we'll see. We'll see. Yeah, thank you for the dialogue. It's an interesting time. So in early October, HSO put out this report, which I've linked in the slides, and it's linked in that document I circulated this morning as well. And that report summarizes the over 16,000 responses they had to the survey that they put out back in the spring and summer. A ton of systemic issues were mentioned and brought up in this report. Only a handful of things related to EDI were mentioned, which I think is unfortunate. I don't know how much of that voice has been heard yet, which is one of the reasons to be talking about this, because I think there's a real opportunity to tell them more in terms of the specifics. So pieces that came out that I thought were of note is this need for culturally sensitive and appropriate care. The report mentions being respectful of residents' intersecting social identities. So there is that intersectional lens that is in there as being recommended. There's also a piece around the importance of family and kinship relationships and the importance of noting the fact that many residents do not have family or friends support, and that the system needs to do better to support those people in ensuring that their needs are being met. Some of the other highlights from that report that aren't EDI related was they heard loud and clear about a need for focus on quality of life, respect, dignity, trust, privacy, these as being really important values for folks, wanting the care to be caring and compassionate, wanting to see interprofessional, competent teams that are collaborative, strong communication, critical thinking, creativity, and the emphasis on the team, including the resident and the family or substitute decision maker. need to really prioritize the rights of the residents and to embody the qualities of what a home is. So privacy, a place that's comfortable, that's clean, having high quality mealtime experiences for folks. And there was also a note around the importance of equitable care for all across all jurisdictions that's consistent, affordable, and to shift the culture of care to be focused truly on care and quality of life over profits, and making improvements to the working conditions and the mental health of the employees working in the sector. So a lot of suggestions around staff health and wellness checks, having appropriate staffing with the correct ratios, and having those people that are working paid appropriately. So there's about 9,000 suggestions in there, many of which cost a lot of money. But I think they're all valid in terms of my review of this report. I mean, I think the issues are really clearly laid out in that report of what they've heard already, which is promising. I think they need more nuance related to the cultural pieces. And this is where these consultation workbooks come in. So in August, HSO launched these 2 different workbooks. One is to be completed by individuals, and the other is for groups. And the groups workbook includes a facilitation guide that gives you suggestions around how you ask these questions and how you set the stage for a group to complete. Each workbook asks about 6 questions, and it takes roughly about an hour to 90 minutes to complete. I've done it twice as a group. I facilitated we run a social worker and social service worker community of practice provincially, so went through the process with that group, and then also we've done it with our team as well. So it's not a super time-consuming thing to do as a group. And basically the committee is reviewing all of the submissions. I heard from Dr. Sinha when I attended the town hall earlier this month that he's legally required to respond and consider every submission that is received. And he has to document how the feedback is being incorporated into the standards. So he's very much reading all of these submissions and integrating them. And that's the work of the committee ultimately. So if ever there's a moment to have a voice heard and wanting to see change, this is probably the best moment in time to do that. So I've included the link to the actual workbooks themselves. They're due to be completed by December the 1st. And so I wanted to just highlight what the questions actually are to give you an idea of what's included in this workbook. So the first question they ask is just for if you're doing it as an organization to describe who you are, what you're all about, and how you relate to long-term care. The next question asks, what are the roles of the participants that are part of that group? And so how do they relate to long-term care? How are they relevant? What do they know? And I think, for OSPN as a group, either this committee or another committee within OSPN, I think having fulfilled a role of providing education in long-term care for a long time, this falls under that option of other. I think many of the trainers who've been going into the homes and interacting with the staff have a really unique lens that would be nice to see captured. So the actual questions themselves, and the questions are interesting, and I'm sure there'll probably be some discussion about what they're asking, but here they are. So the first one, what does safe, reliable, compassionate, and high quality care in long-term care look like and feel like to you? And are there different considerations for residents, for staff, and for family? So giant question, lots of keywords in there. And lots of, when I've engaged in this exercise of answering this question, there's a lot of discussion and a lot of, sort of hold on, what about the basics that aren't even being met right now? Never mind truly compassionate. So a bit disconnected with the reality, I think, as the first question, but anyhow, question 2, how do you balance and respect the rights and quality of life of residents with the need to keep them safe? If there is a most common ethical dilemma in long-term care, this is it, that balance between autonomy, and the duty of care and the duty to keep people safe. And how do you do that, particularly when you have somebody living with dementia, where capability to make decisions isn't necessarily cut and dry. How do you do that when you're in a setting where it's communal living and you've got multiple people's needs and rights competing with each other potentially? And, you know, they've got questions in here around, you know, how do you do this when we're talking about these infection control practices, which are often not in line with what people need or want? Question 3, what does a positive, supportive, and caring work environment look like, and what makes it possible? So some of the questions are really framed in terms of like, what is the vision for long-term care and what could it look like in the future? So I think there's opportunity for real description of visioning and integrating that into the standards, which would be nice. What supports are essential to maintain a healthy and competent workforce? We've seen through COVID how much the workforce in long-term care has struggled. Every home across the province is struggling with shortages of staff. This is becoming even worse with the vaccine mandates that are happening. You've probably been reading about this in the news and whatnot. And, you know, people are leaving the sector because they're burnt out and traumatized from what they've been through. So what can be done to help support that? And then what specifically would make a long-term care home feel more like home? What does resident experience look like? What does the family involvement look like? What activities are available? What does mealtime look like? What do resident rooms and common spaces look like? So, you know, this is something I think we've talked about as a group a number of times, right? What does inclusive LGBTQ friendly care look like? Here's a question where it could be answered from that lens. And question 6, they just basically let you ask any additional questions you think should have been included and provide the answers. So big questions, lots of discussion. You can probably see how this could be a 90-minute discussion easily with an engaged group. I forgot that was my last slide. So yeah, that's basically what the workbook is. So I shared with you that summary document that I went through that sort of highlights it.